Hello to everyone gathered in Washington, D.C. My name is Kazuhiro Ito, and I am Japanese. We are here at the summit of Mount Ibuki, a high mountain located almost in the center of Japan, 1,377 meters above sea level, and a mountain with many myths and legends. I would like to speak to you on denuclearization of North Eurasia. Congratulations! There came a good news. Ukrainian secret troops succeeded in shrinking Russia's nuclear power by destroying their 1/3 of strategic nuclear bombers. Again, congratulations. Since I was 25 years old, I have worked for about a total of nearly 20 years as an official of the Science and Technology Agency and the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology of Japan to improve the level of science and technology in Japan. I started out in the aerospace field. Next, I worked on life sciences, then on promoting science and technology in local areas, Antarctic observations, marine research, earthquake research, space probes, and finally, the field I worked on the longest and most devoted to was nuclear policy. Before I get into the main topic, I would like to briefly explain my involvement in nuclear policy. By doing so, I believe it will be easier for you to understand the background of what I am about to discuss, and my determination will be more easily conveyed. My first job in the nuclear field was nuclear safety. I was convinced that Japan's nuclear power plants were highly resistant to disasters, and in particular had the world's best resistance to earthquakes. However, I began to feel increasingly concerned that there might be a weak point that was not mentioned much in the safety reports on earthquakes, storm and floods, including typhoons, and anti-terrorism measures, whether for commercial or research reactors. That was tsunamis. As you all know, nuclear power generation requires a large amount of cooling water. For that reason, nuclear power plants are built near large rivers, lakes, or the sea. In Japan, being an island nation, we are not blessed with large rivers or lakes, so nuclear power plants are usually built near the coast. However, the endless supply of cooling water on the seashore is inextricably linked to the threat of exposure to tsunamis. My fears were realized within a few years. At the time, I had intended to first read the safety reports of each nuclear power plant and eventually, in coordination with my superiors, colleagues, and researchers, begin research into the resistance of nuclear power plants to tsunamis. Unfortunately, it was too late. Although I am not directly responsible for the Fukushima accident, it shocked me greatly and made me seriously think about what Japan's nuclear policy should be in the future. It was around that time that I went to Washington, D.C. to study abroad in search of a satisfactory answer to what Japan's nuclear policy should be in the future and how it should be positioned in the world. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, is the international nuclear policy that determines the outline of each country's policy. This treaty allows only nuclear weapon states to possess nuclear weapons, and other non-nuclear weapon states are not allowed to possess or develop nuclear weapons. But they do allow the peaceful use of nuclear energy. After various studies, I came to the conclusion that Japan should be more proactive than ever in promoting the peaceful use of nuclear energy, while giving due consideration to safety. However, Russia, China, and North Korea each possess a considerable number of nuclear weapons, and all of them are dictatorships that are hostile to Japan, whose national policy is freedom and democracy. As a country that adheres to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Japan does not want to possess nuclear weapons itself, but we cannot accept that the third city after Hiroshima and Nagasaki will be subjected to such an abominable nuclear attack. Therefore, Japan has no choice but to decide to enter the nuclear umbrella of the United States. And in some cases, the option of nuclear sharing with the United States, as is the case in Europe, is also being considered. However, this does really suggest the future of the free Eurasian countries that will be born after the future dissolution of the Russian Federation and of Russia itself, which will become smaller. The Free Nations of Post-Russia Forum encourages and assumes denuclearization of the various ethnic nations that will be born after the dissolution of Russia. Is there any problem with this? I will explain this based on the argument of Andriy Gurenko, a Ukrainian international political scientist living in Japan. First of all, new ethnic nations require support and cooperation from the international community. Naturally, the first condition for cooperation from the international community is the denuclearization of the country. This is similar to the measures taken by Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan in the past. Therefore, it is impossible for the newly independent countries to try to maintain nuclear weapons. Next, there is a concern that terrorists and other armed groups will take advantage of the chaos to obtain nuclear weapons. To resolve this concern, appropriate involvement from the international community will be necessary. If trustworthy, willing countries organize forces to guard the nuclear facilities of the former Russian Federation until the disposal of nuclear weapon is completed, nuclear weapons will not fall into the hand of terrorists or other armed groups. After that, strict safeguards by the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, can be continued. This is roughly similar to the measures taken in Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Of course, Japan will be happy to cooperate with this. The above measures are likely to significantly reduce the Russian nuclear threat. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky is a major port for Russian nuclear submarines that carry submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBM, but this will be incorporated into the new independent Far Eastern Republic and denuclearized. We in Japan are also aiming to recover Karafuto and Chishima Islands, Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, territories that were deprived of by Russia's illegal invasion. If this is achieved, the Sea of Okhotsk, the main operating area for Russian nuclear submarines, will come under Japanese control, and the secret source of Russian nuclear submarines in the Far East will disappear. However, the best thing would be to force denuclearization not only on the new independent countries, but also on the shrunken Russia mainland. If this could be achieved, half of the world's nuclear weapons would disappear, and the nuclear threat we face would also be halved. The only major aggressive nuclear power remaining would be China, which is considered to be overpowered by the nuclear forces of the United States, Britain, and France. When I was a Japanese government official, I had the opportunity to read old administrative documents written by my predecessors about how they had treated the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons, nuclear technology, and nuclear engineers as part of the West after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I learned that my predecessors at the Science and Technology Agency had made every effort possible to respond to the demand of the international community. Since Japan could not take on nuclear weapons, it was concerned with preventing the outflow of nuclear technology and nuclear engineers from the former Soviet Union. However, looking back at the situation today, I think the measures taken by the West, including Japan, were extremely lenient towards Russia. At the time when the Soviet Union collapsed, nuclear weapons should have been taken away not only from Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, but also from Russia itself. Russia should not have been allowed to take over the seat of permanent member of the UN Security Council, and we should have widely recognized the right to self-determination of the ethnic groups within the Soviet Union and encouraged and approved their independence. At that time, Russia was in extreme poverty and confusion, while the national power of the Western countries was strong enough and Japan's economic power was at its peak. We had the power to carry these things out. If we had done so, wars like today would not have occurred. The world would have been more peaceful, and the newly independent countries would have been able to forge their own destinies, despite the various difficulties, and walk the path to self-reliance, peace, and prosperity. There are actually examples that can be used as reference. I went to Taiwan in September last year to participate in this post-Russia forum. It has been 30 years since I first visited Taiwan, and it has been 15 years since my last visit. Taiwan was once under the dictatorship of the Kuomintang government that had fled from mainland China and had no freedom or democracy. But in the 30 years that I have seen her, she has gained freedom, democracy, and prosperity. The newly independent countries that will escape the yoke of the Russian Federation can also achieve similar results. And if they had been able to do so 30 years ago, they may have been able to achieve the same results as Taiwan. Therefore, all of you in the Western countries that base their countries on freedom and democracy, I ask you to reflect on the mistakes we made some 30 years ago. And today, let us strongly support Ukraine and the peoples that are under the yoke of Russia, defeat Russia, and this time dismantle the Russian Federation. Recognize the right of self-determination of the people living there. Support them and achieve the democratization and denuclearization of the entire Russian Federation. We will guarantee their safety with our sincerity and military power, including nuclear weapons. I believe that the denuclearization and pacification of the entire North Eurasia is one of the responsibilities of Japan, the only country in the world to have suffered atomic bombings, and also one of the responsibilities of the United States, the only country in the world that unleashed nuclear attacks on humanity, and one of the responsibilities of the United Kingdom, France, and other nuclear weapon countries that still handle nuclear weapons with a sense of urgency. Now, everyone, look west from the top of Mount Ibuki. There you can see the beautiful Lake Biwa. And beyond that is our sacred city, Kyoto. And look to the southeast as well. the fertile land of the Nobi Plain is located there. And all kinds of agricultural, commercial, and manufacturing industries flourish, making the city extremely bustling. Those you may see, the skyscrapers are the center of Nagoya, and more to the east, Toyota's headquarters exist. However, in Japan from the late 15th century to the 16th century, the feudal era ruled by the samurai gradually lost order, and feudal lords fought each other, causing chaos in the world. This era of war had already lasted for 100 years, and those who were born and raised in Japan at that time knew only times of chaos. In Europe, there was the 30 Years' War around Germany in the 17th century, and before that, there was the 100 Years' War between England and France from the 14th to 15th centuries. If you consider this, I think people in the Occident can understand how unfortunate this was. However, in the middle of the 16th century, someone appeared who would break this status quo. His name was Oda Nobunaga. He was a feudal lord who did not even control a quarter of Nobi Plain that we can see today. But with his wisdom and strategy, he pacified the entire Nobi Plain over the course of about 10 years. And with the financial and military power he gained from that, he embarked on the military unification of Japan. He pacified the area around Lake Biwa. And using the wealth and manpower he gained from trade and products from there, he advanced further westwards to Kyoto, the capital of Japan. In 1568, just 14 years later, he came close to unified in Japan by force. His fierce battle came to an end when he was attacked and defeated by his subordinate Akechi Mitsuhide at Honnoji Temple on 2nd of June 1582. However, his work was continued by his subordinate Toyotomi Hideyoshi and further developed by his ally Tokugawa Ieyasu, and Japan was unified under the Tokugawa shogunate for 260 years. Japan enjoyed a period of peace and prosperity rarely seen in the world history. We already have the capital to prosper, and we know where to go. Just as Oda Nobunaga once strived with ambition to bring peace to Japan, let us also choose our own path with courage and seek peace and prosperity in Eurasia. With hope and love from the summit of Mount Ibuki, Japan.